Good evening, everyone. I am Giancarlo Guerrero, Music Director of the Nashville Symphony. And I'm going to be honest with you, I am totally like a little schoolgirl here because with me, I have the one and only Terry Riley, one of the most important living composers, not only in the United States, but all over the world. I have been a fan of yours, Terry, for as long as I can remember. And indeed, it is a great, great honor for me to spend a few minutes and speaking with you. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, Giancarlo. Great to see you and hear you.
Thank you, my friend. And as I understand it, can you please tell us where I caught you?
Yeah, I'm in Japan. Came here to do some research for a project for next summer, and I'm very happy where I am. It's a beautiful mountain village here in south of Tokyo, and
wonderful. I guess it's a perfect spot to do some composing and relaxation and meditation.
Yeah, I have like a kind of a little apartment. I'm living kind of like a monk, and I have a little keyboard, and I'm writing with it again, and taking long walks in the mountains here.
Well, that's fabulous. Listen, so let's talk a little bit. Of course, we recorded a couple of your pieces a few years ago, but before getting to that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your own background in music. I mean, how old were you when you started with music?
Well, the first time I started, I was 1939. I started playing violin at 4, and then the war broke out. Right shortly after that. So my music education got put on hold for a while.
Did you come from a musical family? Did you listen to classical music growing up?
No, I didn't. I was kind of isolated musically, but I was always passionate about music. So whenever I got around an instrument, or I always sang when I was a little kid, I always sang. So I had the passion, but not the training.
Well, sounds like me, myself. I mean, I had the passion, but I mean, I had to wait until moving to Costa Rica to actually get an instrument in my hands.
Yeah, well, maybe it's a good thing.
So you went to school and studied composition at San Francisco State University in the 50s. I mean, who were some of your teachers there?
I studied principally with Dr. Wendell Lodi, who was really fantastic, guy full of vitality and interested in all kinds of fields of music. He was a big Thelonious Monk fan, for instance. And so he introduced me to a lot of kind of esoteric music, at least esoteric in the 50s, that I wouldn't have heard because we didn't have the internet or anything. You had to get to a record store and try to find these records and hear these people. So he was really key to my education in those days. I was also studying with Robert Erickson, who was outside of the university, but I studied privately with him. And he was a iconic teacher in the Bay Area. He taught many, like Pauline Oliveros, Lauren Rush, many other composers.
Now, were you learning some of like the basic classical music style formulas, or were you learning just pretty much all different types of genres?
I've always been a little bit out of the box. I resisted some kinds of, I didn't like to take theory courses. And so I kind of did an end run around theory and counterpoint and all that, and kind of learned it on my own. I don't know why, I just wanted to try it out myself and find my own way. So that's the way it developed.
Now, I know that one of your big interests personally is Indian music. I mean, when did that come about, and how did that come about?
Well, it came about because Pandit Pranath, this great Indian vocalist master, came to the United States in 1970. And he came first to Lamont to stay with Lamont Young, who's my lifelong friend. And so Lamont called me and said that he wanted to come to California. So I arranged some concerts in California, and that's where I met him. And then I went back to India with him and spent the next 6 months.
Wow! Now, did you learn to play some of the Indian instruments while you were there?
I know I studied. Well, I was playing tabla before I met Pandit Pranath. I'd actually gotten interested in the percussion and started studying tabla. So I learned enough tabla to accompany him on his concert tours. Right, after we left India, we toured Europe for a while. He was doing vocal concerts around Europe. So I did have that, but mainly I was studying voice with him.
So you did,
which I never expected in my life to do. I love to sing always, but I felt like my voice not good for singing. So, but he said, no, I'll make a voice for you.
Now, are you still following Indian music? Is this something that is still part of who you are?
I've been practicing this morning, waiting for this call. Yeah, I practice every morning, and sometimes other times during the day too.
Wow, good for you. Now, I also know that jazz had a huge influence on you in your musical training and your musical influences. Are there any specific artists that really touched you and that influenced you?
Well, of course, at the beginning, I was totally blown away by Art Tatum because being a pianist and hearing and Art Tatum, that harmonically and inventively was just the most amazing thing to come into my life. So, not that I could ever do anything Art did, but it showed me what the possibilities were. And of course, I loved the greats like Miles and Coltrane and all those I listened to a lot. I think the main thing that I felt the connection was I've always liked improvisation, and that's why I went to study in India, and that's why I like jazz, because it's making music in the moment, trying to create things. Flying by the seat of your pants has always interested me, and seeing what happens.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to go through. The fact that Indian music and jazz have the connection that a lot of it is improvised and is very spontaneous. It is right in the moment, and one performance never, equals the next one. And of course, in jazz and in Indian music, that's kind of put into the DNA. But in classical music, particularly in the 50s and 60s, I mean, that was not the case. I mean, you were supposed to play what was in the music and follow it. So in many ways, I guess you were one of the first people that started questioning why classical music should not improvisatory spontaneity into its art form.
Well, I was sort of thrown into this. I always liked to improvise, but I tried to become a classical pianist. And when I was about 18 or 19, I realized that I was not going to get very far with that. So I decided to concentrate on composition and improvisation. And I could never play a classical piece without taking a detour somewhere. My fingers just didn't obey the mind where it wanted to go. So I thought, improvisation is good for me because I'm unpredictable. So
well, that's not a bad thing. And you know what? Let's remember. I mean, back in the days, Beethoven, Mozart, the great artists, they were supposed to improvise their own cadenzas, and God knows that people flocked to see Beethoven's concert. And one thing that were attracted was Beethoven's famous piano improvisation. So this is nothing really new.
Wouldn't you love to hear one of those? Yeah.
Well, I always tell audiences here in Nashville that when you listen to the piano concertos, Beethoven, right before he died, he wrote improvisations for all of his piano concertos after the fact. Uh-huh. So at least we have an idea of what it must have sounded like. But it is pretty remarkable how he easily can go from one tonality to the next without us even noticing.
Yeah.
I wonder, this guy, had Beethoven lived nowadays, he would be probably one of the greatest jazz players that ever lived.
Yeah, right. He'd be a Keith Jarrett or something.
Well, speaking of spontaneity, I have to bring this up because I think I told you this, but my first introduction to your music came through a performance of your iconic piece in C. And of all places, this took place in Costa Rica, maybe around 1983. I was like 14, 13 years old. And we did this with other musicians from my youth orchestra. And we had an American visiting conductor who prepared us for it and gave us all the instructions. And since then, I got to tell you, I became like the biggest fan of your music and your ideas. And of course, anybody who goes to music school and who studies music appreciation, this piece comes up because it is considered one of the iconic American works that really push the envelope in so many ways, in spontaneity, improvisation, minimalism, etc. So can you tell me a little bit about how the idea came up? How this whole thought of putting this piece together came about?
Yeah. Well, in a word, NC was kind of like just an inspiration, but it came, the idea for the piece came one night and I wrote it down, just very quickly. But I'd prepared myself by trying to write I'd been working a lot with tape loops, and I started working with Chet Baker in Paris, recording him live and looping him and everything. And so I realized there was a piece there for improvisational piece made out of kind of loops. And I'd been trying to write it all out in a big long score. And I'd been working with that idea for maybe a year or two. And then when NC came, it simplified the process for me. I wrote it all down on one piece of paper and realized I didn't have to have a big score with controlling all the parts. everybody could make their own choices there. So when that idea came, it opened up a lot of possibilities for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see that. I mean, this piece was heavily influenced, as we were talking about this, by electronic music at the time. You were already experimenting with electronic music, weren't you?
Right. Yeah, I was, especially tape loops. I was very interested in looping stuff and making kind of funky loops, not really controlling. A lot of times I would just cut up tape randomly, I think inspired by John Cage, and splice together, and I'd hear these really quirky kind of rhythms coming out of these loops, that I would never think of if I tried to create them.
Mm-hmm.
So tape loops were a big teacher for me about a lot of things.
Now,
just listening to them.
Did you know John Cage well? I mean, were you friends with him?
Pretty well, yeah. I was lucky when I was a student at Berkeley, Lamont. We met him, and he would send us music to perform. And then when he came out to California at the Tape Music Center, my wife and I got involved as performers in his work. And then when I lived in New York, I met him several times. We went up to Stony Point where he was living, and we hung out quite a bit. So I would meet him at various places, including Japan. Here, one time I was here when he was doing a big series at Suntory Hall of his new orchestral music just before he died. So, yeah, John was a dear friend and a great inspiration.
Well, I was lucky enough also to meet John Cage when I was a student at Northwestern getting my master's in conducting. He came to Northwestern. He got, I think, an honorary award and a doctorate. And we performed his brand new, the world premiere of his Concerto for Cello and 3 video screens. And it was really, as you can imagine, complete funky John Cage piece. But out of that, I got a signed copy of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which I cherish as part of
my God. Yeah, treasure.
Yeah, absolutely. This was in the early 90s, right? Also right before he died. Speaking of performers, I mean, I know that the premiere of INC basically had like the all-star rock band for the premiere, the people that played the original premiere. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, when I'd come back to Europe I'd come back to San Francisco from Europe, and I started connecting with my old friends there, like Ramon Sender, for instance, and Morton Subotnick, who ran the Tape Music Center, and Pauline Oliveras. And through them, I met Steve Reich, who was living in the Bay Area then, and John Gibson, and some Harris, who happened to be living in San Francisco. So we decided to make a kind of pickup band to perform NC, and we were driving all over the Bay Area trying to find people, and we got about, I think, 15 to 20 people for the first performance put together. But it was all like from people. The great thing about it was they were a mixture of everybody from Baroque musicians to jazz musicians, classical musicians, folk musicians, people that had any music training.
But that's the whole point of the piece, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole point of it.
Right. Well, the piece kind of really developed out of those rehearsals that we did for it, because we started to realize that we were a community trying to figure it out,
Of course.
And yeah.
Well, as I said, I can only imagine the party afterwards. I mean, just, the afterwards after the performance. I mean, it must have been, to be a fly on that wall,
Yeah, it was a very special time, really.
Now, one of the great things about this piece is that you can do it with, any collection and combination of instruments. And it has been done, God knows, with every imaginable crazy combination of instruments. Do you have a favorite performance of INC that has kind of stood out for you?
Well, I like the ones that are really that kind of deviate from the idea of all the rules that I set up. It kind of surprised me. Like Walter Boudreau has done 2 performances of it in Canada, and one was with a big rock group, and the second one was kind of like an opera with all kinds of crazy Indian singing and stuff. And I like the one that was done in Mali with the musicians from Mali, which again deviates from the score. And a lot of those musicians, Andre de Ridder was telling me that a lot of them either didn't have the notes on their instruments, or they couldn't play the pattern. He said, "Could we just play this pattern because this is this is something we know?" And so I like that because it deviates from the score, but it kind of has the spirit of it. So I feel like the piece. I like it when the piece inspires people to their own creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it puts the burden on the performer to compose or to have control over it in the moment.
Yeah. So if people just follow what my original directions, I usually am not so interested because that's been done too much.
Well, the Nashville Symphony a few years ago commissioned your electric violin concerto, and it was written for the soloist Tracy Silverman, who lives here in Nashville. And we did not only performances and the recording here in Nashville, but we also took it to Carnegie Hall for a special concert. And so, can you tell us about the title of the piece, the Palmian Chord Ryddle?
Well, I think it came out of I was searching for a tonality for the opening, and so the series of notes that I can't remember what they were anymore, but series of notes in a dream came to me as to be the solution to the tonality, right? And I thought, well, I don't know a name for this scale, so I'll call it Palmian, and I don't know why. I think it came out of the dream.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, let's listen to an excerpt from the beginning of this work. This one, as I said, is a fabulous piece. And I know that Tracy traveled to your home in California and spent several days together actually improvising with you. Did you know he's playing from before? And I'm sure that making music with him influenced the way that you wrote the piece, correct?
Yeah. Well, Tracy had, I used to have a band called Terry Riley and the All-Stars, and Tracy was one of the members. So we had played quite a bit, concerts of improvised music based on charts I'd written. And I knew he was playing from, many years before we actually did this piece. I always loved his inventiveness in developing that instrument into a real instrument, and he's worked diligently over the years to improve it, and he's written for it himself, and many people have now been attracted to it. So I was really happy that to write a new piece for an instrument that hadn't really been heard much before in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
And it inspired the kind of writing that I wanted to do, knowing how Tracy works. We worked a lot together when he would come to California, you know, improvising, and he would play me stuff, and then and some of it just would end up being in part of the concerto, the ideas.
Well, the next section we're going to listen is from the middle of the piece, and the section is called For Maresa. Do you remember what that is about?
That's the one, the most lyric, I think, section of the piece, more calm and lyric. And Maresa is the wife of great Italian bassist Stefano Scotonibia, who I toured with for his duo. And Stefano unfortunately passed away many years ago, so I wanted to kind of write something for her as a gift.
Oh, well, let's listen to this section called For Maresa. So Terry, you have an impressive list of works. And I also have to say that another time that I became acquainted with you was when I came to school at Baylor in Texas in the early 80s. And Kronos Quartet came to play, and they did a couple of your pieces. And I remember making the connection to when I did in C back in Costa Rica. But you had quite a close connection with the Kronos Quartet, correct?
Yeah, I started working with them in 1980. And it was kind of important connection because from 1970 to 1980, I was spending a lot of time in India and had not done any notated music at all. I was just doing improvised concerts and Indian. David Harrington really prodded me to write something down for the quartet. And they were a very young quartet then, just had only been in existence, a few years. So they were really eager to get a lot of contemporary music into their repertoire.
Well, and something that surprised me when we made the commission to write the Electric Violin Concerto was the fact that I was surprised that you had not written a lot of orchestral music. Actually, a lot of your stuff was either improvised or chamber. Was that something that just didn't attract you, or how come orchestras just didn't become part of your catalog?
Frankly, Giancarlo, I'm a little intimidated by orchestra because I don't feel I understand it well. It seems like such a big complex.
Not from where I am, honestly. Yeah.
So, it took me a long time. I mean, the first orchestral piece was commissioned by Carnegie Hall for their 100th anniversary. When they called me up, I said, "I've never written an orchestral piece." And
well,
I really struggled to write that piece, and it turned out to be a big, long, 1-hour monster of a piece.
But listen, as I said, you're not going to hear a complaint out of me. And this Electric Violin Concerto, the Palmian Chord Ryddle, is to me one of the best pieces that I've had the pleasure of not only premiering but to perform several times. So now let's listen to the ending of this piece, and this last movement is called The Afterglow. The Nashville Symphony CD includes your organ concerto as well, which is titled At the Royal Majestic. And it was premiered by the Los Angeles Philharmonic at Disney Hall. And I understand that during the compositional process, you were allowed to go into the hall and actually play their concert organ. And you told me some funny stories about it. Can you tell us about that process?
Well, the build-up to this piece was I was asked by the LA Phil to do a solo concert there, solo organ concert, which is something I'd never done before. So I said, well, could I have some time on the organ? And the only time available was midnight to 6 a.m. So I went down several weeks. I went down to LA and would spend all night learning the organ there. And it was some of the most mystical experiences I've had, being alone with that amazing organ. And I'd invite all my friends in LA, of course, to come down in the middle of the night and sit and hang out with me. And also people came down from San Francisco. So it was a great build-up to getting to know that organ and I think a prelude to writing.
Wow, that must have been amazing to be, in an empty hall and just literally unleashing all of the demons of that instrument, yes?
Yeah, I could blow the roof off that place, and it was so amazing to do it in the middle of the night.
And without having to worry about, neighbors.
No.
So I understand that you gave the organ a nickname?
Yeah, I called it Hurricane Mama, which I think is stuck. I think that's what they call it now.
That is what they call it. So that is your idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
One of the pieces I played on my solo organ concert there was the concluding piece was called Hurricane Mama, and it was inspired by the sound of that organ.
Well, the piece that we recorded and premiered in Los Angeles was titled at the Royal Majestic. Can you tell us about that title?
Yeah, well, it was, Cameron Carpenter gave the premiere, and Cameron is a bigger than life guy. I thought the title should have this kind of glitzy kind of feeling that reflects a little bit like Cameron's style. And so I thought, oh, that came into my mind, the Royal Majestic, something really big, one of those big movie halls we used to go to in the 40s and 50s.
Well, you remember that the European premiere took place in, and I had the privilege of doing the piece with Cameron at the Philharmonie in Berlin, and that was indeed very special because that organ had just been, remodeled. So we got a chance to basically play this piece on a literally brand new organ in this incredible concert hall in Berlin with the Deutsche Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah, that was an amazing performance, and I still have that in my library, the recording of that.
Well, and that's really the time that we almost at the moment we decided we need to record this. I mean, this was the perfect with the electric violin concerto. So now we're going to listen to a little bit of the second movement, and this one is called the Lizard Tower Gang. Interesting title.
Yeah, I wrote this one in the summer, and I live at a ranch in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and in the summer, the lizards come out, and I had built this kind of like tower to just a little sculpture out in the back, and the lizards would run up and down it and I was searching for an idea for the piece, and one day when I was writing, I was sitting out in the sun watching the lizards, and I thought, yeah, it's a lizard tower.
Well, let's listen to a little bit of the second movement of the organ concerto at the Royal Majestic. This one is entitled The Lizard Tower Gang. So the last movement you titled Circling Kailash, and I have to ask, about that.
Yeah. Well, as I was writing the piece, I thought it had a quality of, for me, of the Himalayas for some reason that kept coming to my mind. And Mount Kailash is a sacred place in the Himalaya, and the Buddhists there circumnavigate, or maybe that's not the right word, but they walk around the mountain as part of their practice, and they do prostrations, and it's a pilgrimage place. And so because the Himalayas kept coming into my mind as I was writing it, I thought that should be the title of the Kailash, is the central part of the Himalaya.
Well, here it is, the ending of the concerto, Circling Kailash. Well, Terry, before we go, I have to share, one bit of information that many of the people watching may not be familiar with. And for me, it was like the coolest thing to find out that this iconic song, Baba O'Reilly by the rock group The Who, actually was named after you. You're one of the inspirations for it. And because apparently the band member, Pete Townsend, considers you to be one of his musical mentors. So you got to tell me about that. I mean, how did that come about?
Well, I didn't find out about it till after they had done it. I learned about it later, but afterwards I got to meet Pete, a few years later after he had written this, and we became friends, and we'd have long conversations. But he told me that he had 30 copies of Rainbow and Curved Air, and he used to drop acid and listen endlessly.
Well, as I said, so, when I read that, I'm like, man, you're the coolest guy I've ever met.
Well, it surprised me too. I can't say I was unhappy to hear that he was a fan.
Well, of course. I mean, as I said, most people know that rock and roll is my main thing that I listen to. The Who is one of the bands that I grew up listening to. And Baba O'Reilly, I've known that song, since I was in my teens. And now the fact that, I accidentally find out that, you're into that in a very, very big way. I think, as I said, I mean, I always tell people, who's the coolest person you have on your phone? Terry Riley.
Thank you.
Well, listen, Terry, it is always a privilege and a joy to speak with you. And although we are, literally thousands of miles away, I feel like you're next to me. And I'm just now thinking that when this is all over, we're going to have to get together, my friend, and make some music.
Absolutely. When this is all over.
Time is too short, and it makes me, I guess, appreciate all the things that sometimes we take for granted. But we definitely got to make something work because I know not only Nashville, but the rest of the world. I mean, they're going to need music to get to the healing process. And
one of the great things is I'm writing a lot here. I'm really doing a lot of writing, and it's a good period for that.
I'll be ready to play it all, man.
Okay, thank you, Giancarlo.
You take good care of yourself, Terry. Be safe, be healthy, and we'll be in touch. And hopefully, we'll see you soon. And thank you again, my friend, for taking the time to speak with all of us.
It's been totally my pleasure, Giancarlo. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.